for a 10-second lag before it starts, and then I will read the online meeting statute. Awesome. The regular meeting of the Transgender Equity Council Policy Subcommittee would now begin. Good afternoon. My name is Track, and I'm the staffer of the Transgender Equity Council. Before we begin, I'd like to note that this meeting includes the remote participation of members as authorized under Minnesota statutes, section 13D.021, due to the declared local pandemic. The city will be recording and posting this meeting to the city's website and YouTube channel as a means of increasing public access and transparency. Board meetings are public and subject to Minnesota open meeting law. I will now call this meeting to order and call the roll so we may verify the presence of a quorum. So as usual, if folks could just unmute and say that you are here when I call your name. Melissa Berner.
Here.
Awesome. Kenzie Weller.
Here.
Awesome. Billy Couric.
Here.
May Brooks.
Here.
Galen Mitchell.
Here.
And David Sensman.
Here.
Thank you. With that, we will proceed to our agenda, a copy of which was posted for public access to the city's Legislative Information Management System, which is available at lims.minneapolismn.gov. And so I also put the agenda in the calendar invite for all of you all. Does anyone have anything they'd like to add to today's agenda? If not, I will go ahead and start with updates from progress on the recommendations. Big thank you to everyone who worked together to make the TEC letter around rent control come together in time. You all did submit that to City Council last week, shortly before they voted on the next steps for the rent stabilization charter amendment. And last Wednesday, they did vote to move one step closer to putting a charter amendment on the ballot. They voted, it was 11-2 in favor. And so the final vote is on August 6th. It is not yet fully on the ballot. The process is moving forward and you all got your letter in. And then the only other new updates I have is that at that same meeting last week, they also voted in favor of putting the community developed charter amendment that would remove MPD as a required department and replace it with a Department of Public Safety on the November ballot. So those two charter amendments that you all had advised on and were following. The public safety one is officially now on the ballot. The rent stabilization one is continuing to move forward, and within a few weeks, we'll have its last vote. Those are the only immediate updates I have. I don't know if folks have questions about either of those.
Quick question on the public safety charter amendment. If I remember correctly, there were kind of two charters that like council was looking at putting on the ballot. One was like the public safety like redefined by the city council, and then public safety like redefined by the community. Is the like community charter on the ballot, or are they both on the ballot?
Yes, thank you. The one that was the community petition one is the one that's on the ballot. The council members withdrew theirs to avoid causing confusion because of how similar it was.
Yes, okay. Okay, good.
Yes.
Thanks for clarifying.
Thank you for asking that. Totally. Does anyone have any other questions about any of that? If not, I wanted to make some space to brainstorm next steps around the presentation from the last TEC meeting by Twin Cities Quorum. And I'll give a really quick summary of that because I know not everyone was able to make that meeting. But essentially, Twin Cities Quorum, which supports LGBTQ owned like small businesses and LGBTQ entrepreneurs locally, is working to expand here at the state level and a number of different places the definition of quote unquote supplier diversity. So the city has requirements that we like spend a certain amount of our money and encourage people we contract with to spend a certain amount of their money with what they called minority owned businesses and women owned businesses, essentially BIPOC owned and women owned businesses. And that's what counts as supplier diversity. Businesses that are registered as LGBTQ owned, owned by people with disabilities and or veteran owned do not count as quote unquote supplier diversity. And so Twin Cities Quorum is working to expand that definition of supplier diversity to cover those other three categories through which a business or an individual can be certified. And is looking for your all's support in that. I'm going to pull up the minutes from the last TEC meeting to see if there's any other smaller details I missed, but does anyone else who was there want to fill in anything else as well? And looking at the minutes, we had asked a question about like what is most useful from the TEC. And the biggest answers were just like pushing this to the mayor and city council, but especially the mayor. This is something that's most likely to be coordinated by the mayor's office. And like echoing and pushing the ways that this is important for the trans community specifically, especially because from what we heard, the like women business enterprise certification tends to exclude trans women and trans femme folks. So the LGBTQ owned business certification would actually be the only way forward for people. So their ask was basically just push this to the mayor and city council. That could look a lot of different ways, but wanted to create some space for you all to reflect on that and talk about next steps you might be interested in or questions you have.
Track, I guess my question would be, what is the best way for us to advocate for this? Like to the mayor's office is like a letter situation, email, phone call, like.
That's a great question. My very transparent answer is in the time I've worked for the city, the TEC has worked more with council than with the mayor, and I don't feel like I have all the strategy answers. My impulse is relationship building and like face to face, whether on a video call or in person, often tends to help things actually like relationship keeps things from just getting lost in the everything. So while I think the letter is great if you all are interested, I would say particularly if there are people who would be interested in meeting with some of the mayor's staff, or if we could get it on the mayor's calendar, actually with the mayor, and then like having this conversation in that context and trying to get an answer from them on necessary next steps might be the most effective. I don't know if there's anyone who would be interested in meeting with mayor staff.
I'd be interested in that, just depending on dates and stuff like that. I'd have to check my calendar, but I would be up for that.
Is there anyone else who would be interested, particularly anyone who isn't also a city staff? I think you should totally do it, Billy, and I think it is probably a little less messy for you if there's also folks who are non-staff in that conversation as well. If no one is interested, that's also an ask we can open up to the wider TEC at the next meeting. I can work on helping schedule that once we get a sense of whether there's anyone else who would want to be. Do folks have other questions, ideas, etc. on this topic? Oh, Billy, you're cutting in and out. I can't understand you.
Would there be anyone maybe potentially from like summit planning? Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can hear you.
Okay. I was gonna say maybe this is a good ask for people on the summit planning, if they would maybe like to attend or know someone who's interested.
Yeah, that could also work, like the TEC folks who've been focusing on that instead.
Well, as far as like entrepreneurs go, or like word of mouth type of situation, if anybody involved in the summit would be potentially interested in meeting with the mayor, I think that would be a good ask.
That makes sense, totally. Do others have questions or thoughts? If not, I would say that whoever reports back from policy at the next TEC meeting, one of the asks is probably asking for if there's anyone else who would want to meet. And I will also bring this up to folks involved in the summit and figure out who in the mayor's office would actually be most useful to connect with. And would say this can't hurt to put in your recommendations to council as well, even if it's more so a mayor issue, just to get it on their radar also. Does anyone have anything else on this before we keep moving? If not, we can move on to talking more through the 2020 or the 2021, excuse me, wow, recommendations. I wanted to give a little more space if anyone had looked more into other national examples. I did a little more research, but haven't found much beyond the like documents and examples I and you all had already pulled up, but didn't know if folks had come up with other things they'd seen elsewhere that they would want to see the city working on, or reviewed anything that's in the SharePoint folder. If not, I guess a second question is, what would you want your timeline to be for these recommendations to council? In terms of getting ahead of the budget process, the mayor is going to announce his proposed budget for 2022 in August, and then council will start like really digging into that. Council will have public hearings for community feedback in November and December around that. They will propose their amendments to the budget in December and then finalize the budget in like mid-late December. I would say anytime between when the mayor announces his proposed budget and when the public hearing starts are fair game for like making recommendations related to the budget with enough lead time for the council members to actually look at them and incorporate them into their amendments. With, you know, once we hit about public hearing time, it gets super hectic and it's very hard to get answers from council members. So I would say ahead of that like peak budget season, but beyond that, it is pretty open to what you all feel like is really realistic for you for drafting them. And if there's other things you're thinking about for timeline, does anyone have thoughts?
this is Davis. So, like, working with that timeline, it sounds like September, October would be a good time for us to aim for. Maybe like end of September to like mid-October. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that makes sense to me. With the summit being the first weekend in October, I would say that I will have the most capacity for back-end support on this, either like more than 2 weeks before the summit. So like early to mid-September or before that, or after the summit. The last 2 weeks of September are going to be a little bit of chaos for me. But if you all have them pretty drafted in advance, then it's totally fine. That's the only like time marker around there I'll add in.
Oh yeah, so maybe we could aim for like mid-September, and then with the idea that then there will be kind of that period of time where it will be hectic, and then if we need the 2 weeks of October to like kind of finalize them up and make any changes. But maybe we should aim for like mid-September, which still gives us like 6 weeks.
That makes sense to me. I see Kenzie's agreement. Do other folks have thoughts?
I think that's a good timeline too, yeah. Because then we can focus on the summit after. It's not like we're doing two things at once. So I'm in favor of finishing it before the summit. Or like mostly drafted.
Perfect. That sounds good as a goal. I'm working on finding the exact timeline of when the mayor's announcing his proposed budget. If I find it, I will let you know. But I can't figure out where I have it. So I will have to come back with that later. In terms of next steps, that means that you all have brainstormed some things, which are kind of sitting in the minutes from different of these meetings, and then have kind of named for like, okay, anything from last year's recommendations that hasn't gotten acted on, we can carry over. And so one of the next steps I'm seeing is just starting to compile some of that information. Is there anyone who would want to be a part of just like pulling the different documents together, starting to reformat this into some recommendations? I'm definitely down to provide support on that as well as needed. Sweet. Thank you, Melissa. Anyone else? Hey, thank you, Kenzie. And my thought is, if you all want to kind of take the next month until the next. Okay, so talking this out loud, actually. The next TEC meeting is in 2.5 weeks. The next policy subcommittee meeting is in 4, and then there'll be another TEC meeting like 2.5 weeks after that, which at that point will be early mid-September. When feels like a realistic deadline for you all to start to have a first draft? Would you want to do it by this next TEC meeting, or do you feel like you need more time?
I feel confident that we could have something by the next TEC meeting. Emphasis on the draft part, but yeah, we could have something.
That's good to me. And I feel like even if you just have like bullet points of what the topics are by the next TEC meeting, and then folks can kind of go over how they feel about the content, and then we work on for the next policy meeting, like pulling that together into more fleshed out language. That could be, does that feel realistic and good?
Yes.
Yeah.
Awesome. And then the other question is kind of the strategy. So obviously there is just this write-up of recommendations, which is what gets sent to all council members and presented. And I'm going to take on the responsibility of actually scheduling that presentation for you all and coordinating kind of the back end. And I will, it's historically the co-chairs who present. So Kenzie, I'll clear with you and Hunter what the possible dates are. So we can pick one in the timeline you all talked about that feels good. But the other question is strategy. So what happened last year is I worked with the co-chairs to send out the recommendations to every council member in advance and like sent them not just in one big like copy everyone email, but sent them directly to each council office, copying their staff. And we're like, is there anything your office wants to work on with relationship to these recommendations? What do you want to take on? At this point, we're going to be like pretty close to an election at the time you all are presenting. So for the council members that are running again, that may be messy in some ways. And for the ones who aren't, their office can't actually take anything on because they'll be gone by January. But we know that that was somewhat effective last year in like getting a little more council support behind some issues. So kind of throwing that out as one piece of strategy and opening for you all. Are there folks who would want to be meeting with council members? Is there like follow-up you want to coordinate for post-election once we know who's actually in office next year? What would feel strategic and doable for you all in terms of not just saying these recommendations to them once, but like getting it at them from enough angles that things move forward?
Do we know who's running or not running yet? I know Philippe's is running again, but he's the only one I know off the top of my head.
Yes, I don't know all of it off the top of my head, but I can definitely find that for you, Grid, if you give me a minute. This is more difficult to find an immediate link than I expected. Do folks have other questions or thoughts while I keep looking? Okay, here we go. You're getting a Wikipedia link to who's running because that's the first thing I could actually find. So it shows, if you scroll down to candidates, it shows in the left column who is currently in that office. And then the right column are the candidates who are actually running. And so where the candidate who's currently in office is not rerunning, their name isn't listed there. So use the left column only for reference of who's in office. It doesn't necessarily tell you if that person is rerunning. I'm not 100% positive that this has all of their opponents listed, but it definitely has whether or not candidates are running again correctly in there.
But even if people are still running, there's a possibility they could not be voted back into office, right?
Absolutely.
This is tricky. Well, I'm not quite sure what to do on the front end, but I do think that it would be a good idea to, after the election, definitely follow up with the different offices so that they know about our recommendations, you know? So if we weren't able to catch them on the front end, then at least we have some sort of communication going on with them. But those are my thoughts.
I will say that where your recommendations are about the 2022 budget, that's still something the current council members, whether or not they are reelected, are voting on before their terms end. So anything that's budget related, you all can still absolutely like send to each council member individually in advance, and it is a realistic ask for them to take action on it. It is the things that are more so about actions they would take next year that are not budget dependent and that wouldn't realistically happen until 2022, where I think that follow-up is going to be extra important, if that makes sense.
Yes. Okay, so then should our strategy be like super highlighting the things that we want to accomplish that would require the budget to do so? Obviously, we still have yet to like compile all of our things, but I don't know. The only thing that I can really think of is getting like, I don't know, like mental health staff as crisis responders, but that's kind of already moving on its own. But let's say it wasn't, like that would be something that we should, you know, talk about because it would require a budget, a large budget for 2022. So that is maybe my strategy, is focusing on those things first and then following up after the election.
Yeah.
I think that makes sense. Is there anyone who would be interested, if council offices are open to it, in meeting with them? Either with whoever's willing or with like a particular office who seems most likely to take something on, or with, you know, the council member for the ward you actually live in, around any of these. Wait, Melissa, was that a yes or was that background noise? I realized that something happened from your audio, but
I just kind of laughed a little bit.
Yeah.
I just like, oh, let's see. I live in Ward 12, so Andrew's mine.
Mhm.
Are you in Ward 12 still, or did you move out of Ward?
No, I was in Ward 6, and I now actually don't know what ward I'm in. But
Andrea is also my ward council member. So yeah.
would either of you be interested in meeting with them if it was relevant?
They actually both look like they're running unopposed at this point. So that would probably be a good start.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I actually haven't even looked at the Wikipedia, but that makes a lot of sense.
That sounds great. And both of them actually often tend to be a little bit more of swing votes around some issues. So it is useful that those are the wards you live in and you're interested in meeting with members. So we've talked about kind of sending the budget related stuff to folks in advance and seeing if we can get meetings, at least for the wards where there are TEC members interested. I think this is another great ask for the whole TEC too, if anyone else would be interested in council member meetings. We've talked about post-election one-on-one follow-up about some of the initiatives that take place more next year, and then obviously the actual presentation. Are there other ways that you all want to strategize kind of pushing these from multiple angles? Galen, I don't want to put you on the spot. I also know that you've served on a similar commission to this in a different city. And so if you all had any strategy that was effective there, would love to hear it. If you didn't actually figure out things other than what we've talked about, also awesome and totally fine, obviously.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that we found anything that was particularly effective. I think that the nature of the work that we do is that we're always going to be like, you know, scrambling to find a way to make an impact and get things done. So yeah. It's all about relationship. You were saying earlier, like the connections that you can make to people and all that sort of stuff. That's what we relied on.
Totally. And I think these one-on-one meetings and the relationship there will likely have a lot of value. So the more folks we have for that, the better.
For sure.
Does anyone else have thoughts, reflections, strategy ideas on these recommendations, or do we feel good to start moving forward with what we have right now?
Nothing more. I think we could start compiling.
I know that I'm sure that once we start the process, we're going to be thinking of like, oh, we should also be doing this and that, and we should organize it in this way. So yeah, I'm sure I'm gonna think of things as it unfolds.
Totally. And is there anyone who is willing to report back from this meeting in the August TEC meeting, including sharing like the ask for who else would want to be in a meeting with mayoral staff about the supplier diversity work, and also the ask for who else would want to meet with council members around recommendations? I will write up the minutes so you don't have to remember everything off the top of your head.
I can report back.
Sweet. Thank you, Melissa.
Just gotta remind myself that I am reporting back.
Perfect. That is all I have then. Does anyone have any other questions or things they wanted to check in about before we wrap up?
Quick question. Does recommendations have 1C?
Spell check hasn't corrected me when I write it with 1C.
Thank you so much.
Love that question. Any others? If not, we can adjourn. I will end this recording.